After World War II, the confrontation between the USSR and the USA led to the split of the world into two opposing camps, which were formed by different economic and military political alliances. This global geopolitical, economic and ideological confrontation continued until the early 1990s. During this time, according to experts, there were more than 400 armed conflicts, and the Soviet Union participated in many of them on different continents. Seeing as Ukraine was part of the USSR, Ukrainian soldiers served in the Soviet army and took the oath. They went and fought, sincerely believing that they were fulfilling their so-called international duty. So why did the leadership of the imperial country drive their troops into the meat grinder? Why did the Soviet Union stop at nothing to export its ideology of socialism to Asia, Africa and Latin America? In mid-1947, the period of the so-called Cold War began, which was characterized by an increase in tension between the West and the East. One of the main reasons for the confrontation was the contradiction between the capitalist and socialist models of development of younger states. These contradictions were the reason for conflicts in different continents around the world. World War II did not end. It slowly moved into World War III. We conditionally celebrated Victory Day in Europe and in the world. Meanwhile, wars continued on different continents, and citizens of the former USSR, including citizens of Ukraine, participated in them.
Граждане бывшего Советского Союза и в том числе достаточно широко участвовали граждане Украины.
The first large post-war military conflict was the War for the Korean Peninsula, which was part of the Japanese Empire by the end of World War II. The war lasted from 1950 to 1953. The United States opposed the USSR together with China in this war. Approximately 30,000 Soviet troops took part in the conflict. One of the first wars in which the interests of these two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, collided was the war in Korea. Our military participated using Chinese names and also wore Chinese uniforms. If we are speaking about the pilots in China, the whole 64th Aviation Corps was formed. The 324th Fighter Aviation Division was headed by Ivan Kozhedub. In this hall to my right is a green uniform. It's my father's uniform. My father was a military advisor to China. This was in the years 1952 to 1954 during the war in Korea. And while our pilots were there, he commanded one of the military schools that were deployed in China.
И он командовал одним из авиационных училищ, которые были развернуты на территории Китая.
The next conflict that was of a similarly large scale in the second half of the 20th century was the Vietnam War. The Soviet Union participated in this war on the side of North Vietnam. In early 1965, the USSR leadership decided to grant large-scale military technical assistance to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. To combat US aircraft, the crews of anti-aircraft missile systems of the Soviet Army were used. I came to Vietnam as part of a group. Why was there such a need for our group? By 1972, the Vietnamese Army, the Vietnamese Air Defense, and the Air Force had great success, and the US aviation forces were forced to descend to extremely low altitudes so that it would not fall into the weapon engagement zone of the S-75 anti-aircraft missile system. Therefore, the Vietnamese government requested the delivery of certain equipment. At that time, such equipment as the anti-aircraft artillery complex ZSU-23-4 Schülke was very effective. Soviet military servicemen were sent to service and develop new anti-aircraft weapons. As a result, more than 10,000 of them took part in the Vietnam War. Air defense was mostly located in Ukraine, therefore there were certainly many Ukrainians. There were guys from the cities of Berdyansk and Poltava. In short, there were many Ukrainians. One of the most famous cases when the world was on the verge of disaster was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. A military confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States in October 1962 was caused by the development of US nuclear weapons in Turkey. In response, the USSR secretly deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba. They didn't tell us anything. There was a legend that the missile battalion was transferred over a long distance. But it was strange that the battalion and the regiment were brought to combat readiness. We were loaded onto the Kurakov ship. We hid the equipment in the holds, and the missiles lined with wooden boards labeled agricultural export were placed on the deck of the ship. As we passed through the Strait of Gibraltar, for some reason we turned south. We thought we were going to the Congo, and when we heaved it back and opened the package, it was written there, Island of Cuba, Republic of Cuba, Port of Matanzas. During the stay of the Soviet military forces in Cuba, there was no combat. Both sides were on a knife edge, but ready for instant action. Nevertheless, there was a serious risk of being fired upon. I was the commander of the firing position, and during such unbalanced periods that were there, we were just fired upon. The town was located in such a place where there were reeds growing, and local residents walked through them and did whatever they wanted to do. And not everyone supported us. The general mood was good, but many of the local residents were opposed to us.
Загальний був настрій хороший, але значна була теж частина таких людей, які виступали проти нас.
Unfortunately, soldiers and officers did not receive the expected respect and gratitude for their service in the hotspots for risking their lives.
Коли ми туди їхали,
when we went there, one very famous military commander swore that we would come back as heroes. He said, accomplish the mission and come back home as proud heroes. And when we returned back, we were divided into groups. We were in a small room with one table and a chair. And each person signed a non-disclosure agreement regarding the state secrets of war. Where were you? What were you doing there? We'll find you if you will spill the beans and tell people what actually happened. This is the way in which our government and country met us. Ukraine suffered the greatest human losses during the armed aggression of the Soviet Union against Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989. This is about foreign military intervention. Afghanistan has lived its measured life. Everything was not settled there. The level of development of society corresponded to the years of 1300. And when the struggle for Afghanistan began, it became a rivalry between the two superpowers on the territory. More than 3,000 Ukrainians were killed during the Soviet-Afghan War. Mostly they were young men under the age of 20. A total of 72 military personnel from Ukraine disappeared or were captured, and more than 160,000 Ukrainians went through the hell of the Soviet-Afghan War. In the 1970s and 1980s, the presence of the Soviet Union was not limited only to Afghanistan. At that time, national liberation revolutions continued on the African continent, where the USSR was also interested in seeking new supporters of the communist regime. The war in Angola was conducted by modern methods, with enemy air raids, long-range artillery, and multiple launch rocket systems. Therefore, Moscow sent military experts there who taught the Angolans to fight. Our troops were in Angola. There were only advisors and experts. The first group of 40 people landed at the end of November 1975. There was one Ukrainian, Vasilyevenko. He was wounded, although he is not considered a combat veteran. Facts about Angola remain classified to this day. The Soviet Union did not recognize that the USSR soldiers were there. Today, it remains the same. We are not there. We were not told where we were going. I got some information about Angola from a nurse who was giving me injections. I asked her, what kind of injections are they? She told me what they were. I was sure that I was going to Yemen. And she was like, not Yemen, Angola. It was then that I found out. The war between Ethiopia and Somalia in 1977 and 1978 for the Ogaden region was no less confusing. The Soviet Union sent 1,500 advisors to Ethiopia. The ports of Ethiopia were full of transport ships with military equipment. They were mostly shipped in from Odessa. People were different. I believe no one was selected by nationality. But for some reason, there were more Ukrainians from Odessa, Kyiv, Dnipro, and so on. I served as a communications specialist for the missile system. We were ordered, together with the Cubans, to cover the only oil refinery. We were assigned to install 2 missile systems there. Our main task was to deploy all this and then later to select people among Ethiopians so that they could study in the Soviet Union. Soviet military advisors and experts participated in wars, hostilities and conflicts in Laos, Algeria, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Guinea, Iraq, Nicaragua, Peru, the Seychelles and other countries. According to estimates of war participants, about 1.5 million people took part in them. It is clear that Ukrainians accounted for a significant part of them. In all these events, the opportunism and criminal character of the actions of the political leadership of the former USSR are dubious, but at the same time, such merits of their rank-and-file participants as honesty, loyalty, duty, mutual help and male friendship generate sympathy. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, everyone hoped that this tragic page of history would be turned over. The controversial political issues will no longer be resolved by military means in the future. Unfortunately, this did not happen. The war came to our country, to eastern Ukraine.